What if one private accusation, never proven, never confirmed, could spark a story that travels faster than the speed of light across the globe? Imagine a whisper, something meant to be contained, that suddenly becomes the headline everyone is reading, tweeting about, and debating. That's exactly what happened in this saga, the one that has dominated media cycles and social media feeds for years. The story of Meghan Markle's alleged private claims about senior royals and the way Prince William found himself at the center of it all. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins not with scandal, not with a public statement, but with a tension so quiet that it could have been ignored. Only, it wasn't ignored. It spread. And it spread because people wanted to believe it, or perhaps because the narrative was too juicy to resist. The idea that Meghan privately accused senior royals of trying to sabotage her life, career, or happiness became a story the world couldn't let go. But here's the kicker. Nothing was ever proven. No document, no recording, no signed declaration, just whispers, leaks, and interpretations. Yet in the world of modern media, whispers can roar louder than verified facts, and interpretations can become accepted truths almost overnight. Now, why should you care about this story today, right now, at this very moment? Because the royals are no longer just a symbol of monarchy. They are brands. They are narratives. They are cultural touchstones whose every gesture, comment, or perceived slight is amplified, dissected, and debated worldwide. And when a story like this one resurfaces, it brings with it the full weight of emotional investment from millions of people who feel they have a stake in the drama, even if they have never met the people at the center of it. So this isn't just gossip. This is modern myth-making, and you, the viewer, are part of it whether you like it or not. So how did this all start? How did a private concern become a global headline that seemed to implicate Prince William, Prince Harry, and the entire fabric of the royal family? It began, predictably, in the press. Newspapers, eager for exclusives and dramatic narratives, began publishing stories based on sources described as close to the palace or insiders familiar with the situation. And while the words were always carefully couched, allegedly, reportedly, sources say, readers rarely noticed the fine print. People wanted certainty, and in the absence of certainty, the narrative filled the void. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Prince William's role in this story wasn't about accusations of his own making. In fact, he rarely spoke publicly about the alleged claims at all. Yet somehow, through indirect statements, carefully timed public appearances, and behind-the-scenes clarifications, he became positioned as the one who exposed what had allegedly happened. The media narrative created a framing device where William was simultaneously protector, narrator, and reluctant participant, all without issuing a single definitive public statement. Isn't it strange how perception can outpace reality? Think about it. How does a narrative like this survive and thrive for years? Part of it is human psychology. Stories of conflict, betrayal, and tension resonate because they touch on universal emotions. Who hasn't felt misjudged, undermined, or treated unfairly? When the media presents these tensions within the royal family, a family that many admire, envy, or feel connected to, it becomes easier for audiences to insert themselves emotionally into the story. Suddenly, you're not just reading a headline. You're imagining yourself in those halls, witnessing those private conversations, wondering what you would have done if you were in Meghan's or William's shoes. And yet, the tension is not purely emotional, it's structural. Think of the royal family as a finely tuned machine. Every action, every word, is calculated and carries symbolic weight. But add in the element of an outsider who marries into the family, a woman with her own career, public persona, and media-savvy background, and the machinery is disrupted. That disruption is exactly what the narrative paints as sabotage. Whether true, exaggerated, or entirely misconstrued, it creates drama because it pits insider knowledge against outsider perception. Now, let's take a step back. Ask yourself, what would you do if someone accused your inner circle of undermining your every effort, of sabotaging your goals or your happiness? And then imagine that this accusation, whether accurate or not, becomes fodder for tabloids and social media, spun, retweeted, and amplified without context. Would you respond? Would you stay silent? Or would you attempt to shape the narrative through indirect means, letting statements leak, timing appearances, and letting the world draw its own conclusions? That's where William's role becomes fascinating. He was not only a central figure in the narrative, but also someone who had to navigate extreme public scrutiny, loyalty to his family, and the demands of modern media. His silence, his appearances, and his careful engagements with journalists and broadcasters created a paradoxical effect. The more he did to clarify, the more people believed they were seeing a reveal, a leak, and expose. Perception, in this case, truly became reality. But the story's staying power doesn't come solely from William's strategic silence or the media's framing. It comes from contradictions, surprising facts, and emotional spikes. For example, reports from different journalists often conflicted about what was actually said in private conversations. One source might describe Meghan's claims as intense but reasonable. Another would suggest they were dramatic or unfounded. And yet, both versions were published, side by side, leaving the public to reconcile conflicting narratives on their own. How do you parse truth from perception when every source has its own agenda? Then there's the timing. Every leak, every report, every media cycle seemed to arrive just when public interest was at its peak. Birthdays, anniversaries, documentaries, social media controversies, they all became catalysts, reigniting the narrative and ensuring it never truly faded. And because the narrative had already been established in public consciousness, each new detail, no matter how minor, was magnified. A simple offhand remark in a documentary or interview could be interpreted as proof of long-standing allegations. And the public lapped it up. At this point, you might be asking yourself, is there any resolution to this story? Has anyone clarified what actually happened? The answer is murky. Because the story exists at the intersection of private experience, media interpretation, and public perception, certainty is almost impossible to achieve. And yet, that uncertainty is what keeps people watching, reading, sharing, and speculating. Humans are drawn to stories that are unresolved, stories that leave them wondering, stories that make them feel as though they are part of an ongoing drama they cannot step away from. So, why does this story matter more than ever now? Because the narratives around Meghan and the royals have evolved, intensified, and multiplied. Every new documentary, interview, or article that revisits past claims adds layers of context and nuance, or at least the appearance of it. Audiences are now far more sophisticated in how they consume these stories, often seeking to parse what is true, what is exaggerated, and what is strategically presented for public consumption. The stakes are higher because the public has grown invested. The story is no longer just a rumor. It has become a cultural phenomenon, a lens through which we examine not only the royals but also media, perception, and the human desire to understand conflict. And here is the crucial point. Even as we analyze, dissect, and debate, one detail remains tantalizingly out of reach. One private comment, one meeting, one sentence, buried, ignored, or overlooked, could dramatically shift the understanding of the entire narrative. And that is where the cliffhanger lies. Because by the end of this video, when we unravel the timeline, dissect the media framing, and examine Prince William's indirect role, you will see how a single allegation, however unproven, reshaped perceptions, fueled debate, and created a narrative that continues to fascinate the world. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment that seemed minor, almost trivial at the time, would ignite renewed speculation, force reconsideration of past interpretations, and bring the entire story into sharp focus once more. It is the kind of moment that leaves you questioning what really happened behind palace walls, and what was simply invented by eager journalists and an audience hungry for drama. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the story we are about to explore is more than just rumor. It is a study of perception, strategy, media influence, and human emotion. By following this narrative closely, by examining the conflicting accounts and the reported insider perspectives, you will not only understand the alleged claims, but also gain insight into how modern stories are constructed, amplified, and remembered. And now, we are ready to begin the deep dive. The narrative is complex. It is contradictory. It is dramatic. and it is filled with moments that challenge everything you thought you knew. The only question left is, are you ready to see what truly lies beneath the headlines? The introduction ends here, and the next chapter, where we trace exactly how the rumors started and gained momentum, is where the real unraveling begins. But before we go there, take a moment to consider this. Sometimes, the most explosive stories are not those that are proven, but those that are believed. And belief, once unleashed, is nearly impossible to contain. What if one tiny spark could ignite a firestorm that engulfs the world's most scrutinized family? That spark, in this case, was a rumor. Not a public statement, not a televised interview, just a whisper, a passing comment, a sentence overheard and then repeated. And yet, as history has shown, whispers can travel faster than official announcements, especially when the world is waiting to be shocked. The story of Meghan Markle and her alleged private claims about senior royals didn't erupt in a vacuum. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A dinner conversation here, a fleeting remark there. Nothing that anyone thought would become a headline. But the machinery of the modern media ecosystem is designed precisely to detect the smallest anomalies and inflate them to global proportions. It's crucial to understand the environment in which this rumor first emerged. Meghan had married into a family that is not only wealthy and powerful, but also highly traditional and highly scrutinized. Every gesture, every word, every glance is cataloged, interpreted, and evaluated. Add to that the media's relentless appetite for drama, and the stage was set for a single whisper to transform into a global narrative. So how did it start? According to multiple media analyses, the earliest reports came from insiders and anonymous sources who were allegedly close to the palace. The exact wording of the alleged accusation was never fully disclosed, and the context was often vague. But the implication was enough. Meghan privately expressed concerns that certain senior royals were undermining her in ways that went beyond normal palace politics. Now, pause for a moment. Think about what that means in practice. Private concerns, by definition, are not accusations meant for public consumption. They are often tentative, reflective, or even misinterpreted. But the media thrives on interpretation. When sources hint at drama, journalists read between the lines. Editors amplify subtle details. And suddenly, what was once a quiet concern inside a private residence becomes a story of alleged sabotage, betrayal, and palace intrigue. At first, the coverage was cautious. Headlines used words like allegedly, reportedly, and sources say. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. And in the world of modern journalism, seeds of doubt can quickly grow into trees of speculation. Social media users, eager for the next scandal, amplified these early reports. Online forums dissected every possible scenario. Analysts speculated about motivations, timelines, and consequences. Every post, tweet, and article added layers to a narrative that was, at its core, unverified. And then, there were the contradictions. Different outlets reported slightly different versions of the same event. One claimed that Meghan privately accused the royals of undermining her career. Another suggested she felt emotionally isolated and strategically blocked from key opportunities. A third hinted at a combination of both. The truth was murky. But the public doesn't always need certainty. It thrives on drama. And so, even conflicting accounts serve the same purpose, keeping the story alive and igniting debate. Here's where it becomes even more interesting. The timing of these early reports. They didn't appear randomly. Many coincided with moments of heightened public attention, a major royal event, a high-profile interview, or even the release of a documentary. When rumors are timed to coincide with peak public interest, they gain traction more quickly because the audience is already paying attention. It's a strategy that isn't always deliberate, but it is remarkably effective. Now, let's consider the role of perception. For millions of people around the world, the narrative was framed in simple terms. Meghan had alleged that senior royals were sabotaging her, and William, by extension, was somehow involved. The complexity of palace life, the nuances of private conversation, and the human emotions behind every statement were flattened into a story that was easy to digest, easy to share, and easy to believe. And yet, even as the narrative solidified, the truth remained elusive. No concrete evidence of sabotage emerged. No document, no audio recording, no formal complaint. The story existed in the gray space between private conversation and public speculation. And that gray space is exactly where rumors thrive. Because when there is no definitive proof, the mind fills in the gaps. And that's exactly what happened. Think about the human element here. Imagine being a member of a family where every private concern could be twisted into public controversy. Every word, every gesture is under surveillance. Whether by actual paparazzi, eager journalists, or the endless scrutiny of social media. How would you protect yourself? How would you communicate privately without fear that your words could become headlines? This context is essential to understanding why a single whispered accusation could grow into a narrative that consumed headlines for months and eventually years. And then there's the media ecosystem itself. Tabloids, online platforms, social media algorithms, and public commentators all play a role in amplifying stories. An unverified report can be shared thousands of times within hours. A subtle phrasing can become a sensational headline. Analysts, commentators, and influencers interpret, exaggerate, and speculate. The rumor snowballs, taking on a life of its own. Consider also the emotional stakes. Stories about betrayal, sabotage, and family conflict evoke strong emotions in audiences. People feel outrage, empathy, or even schadenfreude. And emotions, as we know, are powerful motivators for sharing content. Once people feel emotionally invested, the story becomes a part of their personal experience. It's no longer just news, it's drama, it's narrative, it's story. Here's a fascinating contradiction. While the alleged claims were private and unproven, they became one of the most publicly discussed narratives of the year. Why? Because humans are drawn to conflict. We are wired to notice disputes, tension, and emotional drama. The royals, with their global visibility and symbolic power, are the perfect lens through which to explore these dynamics. And when a narrative involves high stakes, secrecy, and personalities that the world thinks it knows, the public is irresistibly drawn in. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because the rumor, which started as a quiet whisper, soon intersected with Prince William's role. He had not made public accusations. He had not leaked information. But somehow, the narrative positioned him as the one who exposed the alleged claims. How does that happen? How does someone who remains largely silent end up framed as central to a global controversy? The answer lies in indirect communication. Public appearances, carefully worded statements, and the strategic release of insider commentary all contributed to shaping the narrative. William's silence was interpreted, analyzed, and reported on as though it were a statement in itself. And in the media world, perception is often more important than fact. By the time the public caught up, William was cast in a role he never actively sought. The one who clarified, the one who exposed, the one whose presence alone gave the story weight. But even this framing has its contradictions. Some reports suggested that William sought to protect family privacy, while others implied he was defending the institution of monarchy. Some narratives claimed he was frustrated with media misrepresentation. Others suggested he was strategizing to control the story. In reality, we may never know his true intentions. What is clear, however, is that perception created a storyline that captivated the public and dominated media cycles. Now, pause and consider the mechanics of a rumor becoming a narrative. First, there is the seed, a private statement or observation. Then comes amplification. Journalists, insiders, and media outlets report, often with caveats. Next is interpretation. Audiences, commentators, and analysts fill in the gaps with assumptions, biases, and speculation. Finally comes reinforcement. Social media, follow-up stories, and recurring public interest cycles ensure the narrative persists. By the time the public is fully aware, the story has grown far beyond the original whisper. And here's the final twist for this chapter. Even as the rumor spread, there were moments when it could have been contained, clarified, or corrected. Yet those moments were fleeting, and by the time any clarification appeared, the story had already taken root in public consciousness. The rumor had become a legend of sorts. A narrative that seemed larger than life, fueled by imagination, emotion, and media dynamics. So, What does this tell us about the moment the rumor started? It tells us that the spark was tiny, almost invisible. It tells us that perception can outrun reality. It tells us that private concerns, when leaked, can become global narratives that shape public opinion. And most importantly, it tells us that even the most careful attempts at privacy can be swept away once a story captures the world's attention. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The rumor, once quiet and contained, was about to collide with timing, media strategy, and high-profile appearances in ways that would amplify it beyond imagination. The firestorm was building, and the players were about to enter the arena. What if the press didn't just report the story, but created it? What if the very idea of sabotage didn't come solely from a private conversation, but from the way headlines, articles, and social media amplified a single, ambiguous statement? This chapter isn't just about what Meghan allegedly said or felt. It's about how those private words were transformed into a public spectacle that gripped millions around the world. The moment the rumor about sabotage surfaced, the media had already prepared a fertile ground. Consider the environment: tabloids hungry for sensational stories, online news sites competing for clicks, and social media algorithms engineered to amplify controversy. A phrase like "senior royals undermining her" becomes a headline that sparks curiosity, outrage, and debate all at once. And that, more than the original comment, shaped public perception. Let's break this down. Newspapers, particularly the UK tabloids, framed the alleged claims as a story of palace intrigue. Phrases like "accusations of sabotage" and "private claims exposed" appeared alongside dramatic photographs, contrasting Meghan in glamorous settings with images of the royals looking solemn or serious. The visual juxtaposition alone communicates conflict without a single word. The headline does the work. The reader is primed to interpret the story as scandalous, urgent, and emotionally charged. But the press didn't stop at reporting. It analyzed, theorized, and even dramatized the claims. Columns speculated on motivations, why Meghan might feel marginalized, whether certain royals were intentionally obstructing her, and how these tensions reflected on the monarchy as a whole. Headlines posed questions rather than providing answers, inviting readers to form conclusions, which further amplified emotional engagement. Did the palace sabotage Meghan? Was she being unfairly blocked? Is this a family feud the public will never understand? Each question functions like a spark in a powder keg, igniting curiosity and emotional investment. Here's a surprising fact. At no point did any mainstream outlet present verified evidence of sabotage. Yet the narrative spread rapidly, almost as though the absence of proof was irrelevant. Why? Because human brains are wired for storytelling. Conflict, drama, and mystery are compelling. Even in the absence of confirmation, the story satisfied a psychological craving for intrigue. Social media magnified this effect exponentially. Every share, retweet, and discussion contributed to the perception that the allegations were credible, even if no proof existed. And contradictions abounded. Some reports suggested that Meghan's claims were a result of misunderstanding, while others framed them as deliberate attempts to disrupt palace operations. Some journalists presented them sympathetically, highlighting emotional stress and isolation, while others emphasized strategic maneuvering or ambition. The public encountered multiple, often conflicting narratives simultaneously, forcing audiences to reconcile differences in their minds. Which version was true? Perhaps all, perhaps none. The ambiguity kept people hooked. Timing played another crucial role. Many of the early stories appeared around major royal events: weddings, births, official visits, anniversaries. These moments guarantee attention. Readers, already invested in the royals' personal and public lives, were primed to consume stories of conflict. The press knew this and leveraged it expertly. An unverified claim, strategically timed, becomes a narrative that dominates headlines for weeks, even months. But what about credibility? How could stories with no proof gain traction? This is where the interplay of language, sourcing, and repetition comes in. Phrases like "insiders claim" or "sources close to the family say" create an aura of authority. Even if no evidence is presented, the reader subconsciously interprets it as trustworthy. Repetition compounds this effect, The same claim appears across multiple outlets, each presenting it slightly differently, but consistently enough that the narrative feels validated. The human brain begins to treat repeated statements as fact, a phenomenon known as the illusory truth effect. Here's another twist. The idea of sabotage resonated precisely because it tapped into pre-existing public narratives about the royals. Meghan, as an outsider entering a centuries-old institution, was already subject to intense scrutiny and speculation. Reports of tension or friction fit neatly into a story the public already anticipated. An ambitious outsider challenging tradition, meeting resistance from an entrenched system. Confirmation bias ensured that readers interpreted every report, every rumor, and every visual cue in ways that reinforced the sabotage storyline. Let's talk about emotional beats. Headlines like "Sabotage in the Palace" or alleged claims of undermining surface evoke strong feelings: anger, empathy, surprise. Audiences react instinctively to conflict, particularly in a context as emotionally charged as a royal family. Some readers sympathize with Meghan, imagining the pressure she faced. Others side with William or the institution, perceiving the claims as unfair or manipulative. Either way, emotion drives engagement, and engagement drives narrative amplification. Social media accelerated the process. A single article could be shared thousands of times within hours. Users add commentary, memes, and interpretations, which further entrench the narrative. Algorithms favor content that provokes reaction, meaning the most emotionally charged stories rise to the top. The rumor of sabotage became a self-perpetuating cycle. Media reports amplify it, the public reacts, social media amplifies reactions, and the cycle repeats. And here's a subtle but critical point. The narrative of sabotage wasn't static. It evolved. Early reports suggested vague feelings of exclusion. Later interpretations added strategy, intent, and emotional drama. Each iteration made the story more compelling, more dramatic, and more shareable. The story became larger than the original claim, a living entity shaped by journalists, commentators, and the audience itself. At the center of all this was a paradox. The less confirmed the allegations, the more intriguing they became. Certainty often diminishes curiosity. Ambiguity fuels it. A story that is unresolved, that leaves room for speculation, is far more likely to capture attention, spark debate, and maintain engagement over time. This is exactly what happened with the sabotage narrative. Every new article, every documentary segment, every social media thread added layers of speculation and interpretation, keeping the story alive for months. Consider also the interplay of humor, analogy, and surprise in media coverage. Commentators frequently drew comparisons between palace dynamics and high-stakes corporate boardrooms, reality TV drama, or classic literary feuds. These analogies serve multiple purposes. They simplify complex dynamics, make the story relatable, and heighten emotional engagement. The narrative of sabotage becomes a story the audience can understand, even if they have no first-hand knowledge of palace life. But the stakes weren't just narrative, they were personal. Public perception matters in a monarchy, both for the individuals involved and for the institution itself. The story of alleged sabotage could not be dismissed lightly. Even if unproven, it shaped how audiences viewed Meghan, William, and the royal family as a whole. Reputation, after all, is a kind of currency, and in a system where every gesture carries symbolic weight, perception can influence power, privilege, and public support. And here comes the twist that sets up the next chapter. While journalists framed the narrative as sabotage, Prince William's indirect involvement added complexity. He was not accused of sabotage, but his silence, strategic appearances, and carefully worded statements positioned him as the figure who could confirm, deny, or clarify the allegations. The media, intentionally or not, cast him as the counterpoint, the one who might hold the key to understanding the entire controversy. But even this framing had contradictions. Different outlets suggested different motivations for William's actions or inactions. Some implied protection, others strategic maneuvering, and still others hinted at frustration with media misrepresentation. The result? The public was left in suspense, unsure of what to believe, and compelled to keep following the story. The takeaway is clear. The press didn't just report the story of alleged sabotage. They amplified, interpreted, and dramatized it in ways that ensured global attention. The narrative took on a life of its own, fueled by human psychology, social media dynamics, and the ever-present hunger for drama. And at the center of this maelstrom was William, whose indirect involvement became a critical pivot point for the story's evolution. So what came next? The rumor of sabotage, amplified and interpreted by the press, was about to collide with the personal and strategic world of the royals. And that collision would create moments of tension, confusion, and dramatic twists that nobody saw coming. The story was no longer just about a whispered allegation. It was about perception, media power, and the human desire to make sense of conflict in a world obsessed with narrative. But the real question remained: how would Prince William, positioned at the heart of the controversy, respond or not respond? And how would that shape the public's understanding of what was allegedly happening behind palace walls? The next chapter begins to answer that, revealing how William became a central figure in a story he did not directly start, yet could not ignore. What if someone could become the central figure in a controversy without ever speaking publicly about it? That is precisely what happened with Prince William in the narrative surrounding Meghan Markle's alleged private claims. He did not make formal accusations. He did not leak information. And yet, in the eyes of the media and the public, he became the pivotal figure, the one whose actions, words, or even silence were interpreted as confirmation, contradiction, or judgment. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the early days of the narrative. Reports of alleged sabotage by senior royals were circulating, but at that time, William had not publicly engaged with the story. His role, as far as the public could see, seemed passive, but the narrative rarely needs direct participation to place someone at its center. The perception of centrality can be just as powerful. In William's case, indirect signals, brief public appearances, carefully timed photo ops, and the occasional reported statement were enough for journalists to position him as the person responding to the allegations. One of the most fascinating aspects of this dynamic is how silence itself becomes a form of communication. William's measured restraint, his refusal to comment directly, and his avoidance of media spectacles could easily have been seen as disengagement. But in a media ecosystem primed for drama, silence is never neutral. Every absence of a statement becomes fodder for speculation. Is he furious? Is he protecting the family? Does he agree, disagree, or something else entirely? The audience fills in the gaps, often with dramatic assumptions that amplify the narrative. And here's an intriguing point. Perception of authority magnifies influence. William, as heir to the throne and a senior figure within the royal family, is automatically seen as a gatekeeper of truth. When rumors of sabotage emerged, the public instinctively looked for a figure of authority to contextualize them. Without issuing a formal statement, William was framed as that figure. His position within the family hierarchy made him central, whether he sought the role or not. The media quickly seized upon every appearance, every gesture, and every nuanced word. A public event where William appeared solemn was interpreted as a reaction to the alleged claims. A seemingly neutral interview was dissected line by line. Even secondhand reports from sources described as close to William were treated as confirmation of his perspective. Each of these instances contributed to the perception that William had exposed the narrative or was at least strategically managing it. Consider the psychology at play. Humans are naturally drawn to patterns and hierarchies. When faced with conflicting stories, audiences gravitate towards central figures who seem to hold the keys to understanding. William's position in the royal family, combined with his public visibility, made him the perfect narrative anchor. He became the lens through which the public interpreted Meghan's alleged claims, even though, technically, he had not issued any direct confirmation or denial. And yet, his indirect involvement carried emotional stakes. Behind the scenes, sources suggest that family loyalty, concern for institutional reputation, and personal relationships all played a role in how William navigated the narrative. He had to balance protecting the monarchy, managing public perception, and maintaining familial bonds, all under intense scrutiny. Every move, every pause, every carefully choreographed gesture was analyzed as a potential signal, which only intensified the public fascination. Timing again proved crucial. William's public appearances often coincided with spikes in media interest. Whether attending official events, charity functions, or commemorative ceremonies, journalists and commentators interpreted his presence or absence as relevant to the narrative of alleged sabotage. Even a quiet walk, a thoughtful gesture, or a muted smile could be read as a response, affirmation, or critique. The public, hungry for insight, filled in the blanks with dramatic assumptions. And then there were the subtle signals, the micro-behaviors that only trained observers or dedicated followers might notice. How he interacted with other family members, the tone of his statements in public engagements, and even the choice of locations for certain events all became elements of storytelling. Analysts dissected these signals as if decoding a hidden message. The result? William was cast, almost inevitably, as the central figure capable of clarifying the narrative, whether he wanted to or not. But there's another layer to consider: the media's need for heroes and villains. In any compelling story, audiences seek identifiable figures to root for or against. William, as the loyal brother, protective son, and future king, fit the role of counterbalance to the allegations. Whether or not he actively sought this position, the narrative framed him as a stabilizing force, the one who could respond to rumors of sabotage, contextualize claims, and provide a sense of authority. This framing also created tension. While some reports suggested William was defending the family, others implied frustration or strategic maneuvering. These dual interpretations enhanced the drama. The public could imagine him as sympathetic, calculating, or conflicted. The narrative thrived precisely because it allowed multiple, even contradictory, readings of his actions. Audiences were engaged not just with the facts, but with the story of his internal reasoning and emotional navigation. An interesting contradiction arises here. While the public viewed William as central, he was simultaneously constrained by duty and protocol. Royal etiquette and expectations of discretion limited what he could say publicly. Every comment had to be carefully measured, every appearance calculated. In a way, these limitations intensified the narrative. Because he could not speak freely, the media filled the vacuum with interpretations, further cementing his role as the figure exposing or managing the alleged claims. Let's also consider social media. Online commentary amplified William's perceived centrality. Memes, threads, and debates dissected every gesture and phrasing attributed to him. The combination of traditional media and digital amplification created a feedback loop. Every report on William drove further speculation, which in turn created new reports. He became the focal point not by action, but by perception, shaped by both media framing and audience engagement. Here's another striking point. The narrative relied on a subtle interplay between fact and interpretation. While the allegations themselves were unverified, the media framed William's involvement as factual because of his status and visibility. Audiences, consciously or unconsciously, interpreted any indirect engagement as evidence that he had responded or exposed the situation. In other words, William's role was constructed largely through perception, reinforced by repetition and strategic observation. But this centrality was not without tension. Different outlets and commentators presented conflicting analyses of his actions, creating uncertainty and suspense. Some framed him as protective and loyal. Others suggested frustration or strategic intent. The audience, caught between interpretations, remained captivated, eager for clarity that never fully arrived. Ambiguity, in this case, became a narrative tool, keeping viewers engaged and invested. Now, consider the human dimension. William was navigating personal relationships, public responsibilities, and a story that had taken on a life of its own. His every move was scrutinized, his intentions dissected, and his emotions speculated upon. Imagine the pressure of being simultaneously a brother, son, future king, and the center of a global narrative, without being able to speak freely to clarify, defend, or refute. Every decision carried symbolic weight. Every gesture was amplified. And the story, fueled by rumor, perception, and interpretation, became impossible to contain. And here comes the cliffhanger that transitions into the next chapter. While William had become central to the story, his position was precarious. The rumor of sabotage was evolving, the media was escalating, and the public's attention was relentless. What would happen when the next twist emerged? When private concerns intersected with public scrutiny in a way that could not be ignored? How would William navigate a narrative in which he was both observer and participant, authority figure and misunderstood actor? The answer lies in the next chapter, where we explore the private conversations and moments that continued to shape public perception, and where the tension between silence and exposure reached a dramatic new level. What if everything you thought you knew about a story was only half the truth? Private conversations have a peculiar power. They are fleeting, nuanced, and often misunderstood. Yet, when leaked or interpreted by outsiders, they become almost legendary. In the saga of Meghan Markle and the royals, certain private conversations, never fully confirmed, always secondhand, have dominated headlines, fueled speculation, and left audiences debating their meaning for years. These are the moments that, in theory, should have remained private, yet they shape the public narrative like nothing else. The first layer to understand is context. Meghan entered a family steeped in centuries of tradition, hierarchy, and public scrutiny. Every statement she made, every concern she expressed, was instantly magnified, not only by media reporting, but also by the expectation that she would navigate palace life with impeccable skill and diplomacy. Private conversations in such an environment carry enormous weight. Even casual remarks can be interpreted as evidence of tension, dissatisfaction, or conflict. The press seized on the term immediately. Headlines used sabotage as shorthand for drama, creating instant curiosity and emotional engagement. Readers were drawn to the story because the word suggests conflict, betrayal, and high stakes. It promises an inside look at tension that most people can only imagine. And because the word is vague, it invites interpretation. Did it mean career sabotage? Emotional manipulation? Strategic exclusion from opportunities? Each reader could imagine their own scenario, and the ambiguity ensured the story's persistence. But what did sabotage actually consist of, according to reported sources? Accounts vary widely. Some suggested that Meghan felt isolated from key decision-making or excluded from traditional family activities. Others claimed she perceived certain members as actively undermining her reputation or limiting her influence. The alleged sabotage could be emotional, operational, or symbolic. It was rarely tangible, rarely documented, but always framed as impactful, enough to create tension and drama in a narrative that spanned continents. Here's an important twist. Perception often matters more than fact in shaping narrative. Even if no deliberate action occurred, the mere belief that she was being undermined fueled emotional response, media framing, and public speculation. Human psychology responds to perceived betrayal or conflict, even in the absence of objective evidence. This is why the term sabotage gained traction so quickly. It wasn't about proof, it was about resonance. Timing also played a key role. The term sabotage appeared repeatedly around key moments, during interviews, in documentary segments, or following public appearances. Each time, media outlets presented it with dramatic framing, bold headlines, images of solemn family members, and commentary that emphasized tension. The repetition reinforced the narrative, creating a sense that sabotage wasn't just alleged, it was assumed. Audiences began to accept it as part of the story, even in the absence of verification. And then there is interpretation. Some journalists framed sabotage as systemic, suggesting that institutional structures were resistant to outsiders. Others portrayed it as personal, implying that certain family members intentionally acted to limit Meghan's influence or undermine her confidence. Both interpretations coexisted, adding layers to the narrative. The result was a story that was complex, emotionally charged, and endlessly debatable. Humor, analogy, and storytelling were critical in making the narrative accessible. Some commentators compared palace life to corporate boardrooms, where power plays and subtle maneuvers determine influence. Others likened it to literary dramas or reality TV, where minor incidents are amplified into existential crises. These comparisons help audiences understand abstract or opaque situations, turning subtle interpersonal dynamics into digestible and engaging stories. But here's the paradox. While sabotage suggests intent, much of the alleged evidence was circumstantial or subjective. Private comments, perceived slights, or unverified reports were framed as part of a larger, coherent narrative of obstruction. The ambiguity created tension and sustained engagement. The audience became invested not only in what happened, but in whether sabotage was real or imagined. This ambiguity fuels debate, keeps discussions alive, and drives global fascination with the story. Emotional stakes were high. Sabotage is inherently dramatic. It implies betrayal, conflict, and risk. Readers and viewers naturally gravitate toward these narratives because they evoke strong feelings. Sympathy for the allegedly targeted individual, outrage toward perceived perpetrators, and curiosity about outcomes. The alleged claims of sabotage allowed the audience to enter the story emotionally, imagining themselves in Meghan's position or placing themselves in the shoes of those accused of obstruction. And here's a critical point. The media framed sabotage as both personal and systemic. Personal, because it involved relationships and interactions between Meghan and family members. Systemic, because it suggested structural resistance within the royal institution. This dual framing created depth, making the story compelling on multiple levels. It wasn't just a personal grievance. It was an institutional drama with emotional, symbolic, and social dimensions. Then came the contradictions. Some reports suggested that sabotage was unintentional or misperceived. Others framed it as deliberate, consistent, and strategic. The inconsistency didn't weaken the narrative. It strengthened it. Humans are drawn to unresolved tension. Contradictory accounts invite debate, speculation, and repeated engagement. The ambiguity of sabotage became a tool for retaining audience attention. William's indirect role again becomes significant. While he was not accused of sabotage, his responses, or lack thereof, were framed as pivotal. Media interpretations suggested he might validate, mitigate, or refute the alleged claims simply through public appearances or subtle gestures. In a story built on perception, his centrality amplified the emotional impact and credibility of the sabotage narrative. Social media amplified the stakes. Hashtags, memes, threads, and discussion forums dissected every nuance. Every article, no matter how speculative, was shared and debated. Algorithms favored content that elicited emotional response, ensuring that the sabotage narrative reached millions rapidly. Even those unfamiliar with palace protocols could grasp the stakes and participate in the debate. Yet, as the story spread, the line between allegation and fact blurred. The public, exposed to repeated framing and commentary, began to treat sabotage as verified, even though no concrete proof existed. Repetition, combined with authority signaling, quotes from insiders, expert commentary, and media amplification, cemented the term in public consciousness. This brings us to a crucial insight. Sabotage, as it existed in this narrative, was as much about perception as reality. It was a narrative device that provided tension, emotional engagement, and ongoing debate. It framed relationships, highlighted institutional complexity, and offered audiences a story they could emotionally invest in. It mattered less whether sabotage actually occurred and more that audiences believed it might have. And here comes the cliffhanger. While the term sabotage dominated media narratives, the next twist would deepen the story. William's responses, Meghan's actions, and new reports from insiders would collide, creating a moment that would reshape public perception and drive the drama to its next peak. The narrative of sabotage was about to intersect with reality in ways nobody saw coming, leaving audiences on the edge of their seats. What if the story you thought you knew wasn't just a story, but a product of amplification? That's exactly what happened with Meghan Markle's alleged claims of sabotage and Prince William's central role. Media amplification didn't just report the narrative. It transformed it, magnified it, and propelled it to global attention. Without this amplification, private concerns might have remained just that, private. Instead, they became an international spectacle, dissected and debated endlessly. The first mechanism of amplification is repetition. Stories of alleged sabotage appeared in multiple outlets almost simultaneously. Tabloids, online news sites, television segments, and social media accounts all covered the narrative, often quoting the same anonymous sources. Repetition is psychologically powerful. The more often we encounter a statement, the more likely we are to treat it as true. By the time audiences were fully aware, the rumor had acquired the weight of apparent credibility, even in the absence of proof. Consider the language used. Words like allegedly, reportedly, and sources claim create a veneer of caution while still signaling drama. Headlines with words like sabotage, betrayal, and undermining evoke emotional responses instantly. This combination of cautious authority and emotional charge is a hallmark of modern media amplification. Readers and viewers are drawn in, hooked, and compelled to seek the next update. Timing was another key factor. The media strategically reported these stories around major events, royal appearances, interviews, anniversaries, and public engagements. Each surge in coverage ensured maximum attention. For example, when Meghan appeared at a public function, outlets speculated about whether she had reconciled with family members or if the alleged sabotage narrative would resurface. Every public moment became evidence for ongoing stories, feeding a cycle of amplification. Social media further accelerated the spread. Tweets, shares, memes, and discussion threads multiplied the reach of every article. Platforms reward engagement. Posts that provoke outrage, curiosity, or empathy are amplified by algorithms. Suddenly, a private conversation, filtered through multiple interpretations, reached millions within hours. Audience participation reinforced the narrative, creating a feedback loop where speculation became part of the story itself. Visual cues amplified the narrative as well. Photos of Meghan and William, solemn expressions at public events, and symbolic imagery were paired with articles to create emotional impact. Even without context, audiences read meaning into gestures, body language, and proximity. A glance, a hand movement, or a carefully chosen outfit could be interpreted as confirmation or contradiction of alleged sabotage. These visual cues, amplified repeatedly, contributed to the sense of drama. The role of insiders and anonymous sources cannot be understated. Media reports frequently cited palace insiders or sources close to the family, creating the illusion of credibility. Even when direct evidence was lacking, the repeated assertion that these sources existed lent authority to the narrative. Readers subconsciously trusted that someone in the know had confirmed the story, further amplifying its perceived legitimacy. Here's a psychological twist. Audiences are drawn to unresolved narratives. Ambiguity drives curiosity. By framing stories of sabotage with uncertainty, allegedly, reportedly, sources say, the media ensured that audiences remained engaged, speculating about motives, outcomes, and hidden dynamics. The narrative became a puzzle, and human brains are wired to solve puzzles, seeking closure that often never arrives. Humor, analogy, and metaphor also enhanced amplification. Commentators liken palace life to corporate power struggles, reality TV drama, or literary family feuds. These comparisons make abstract power dynamics understandable and emotionally resonant. They also reinforce the narrative by giving audiences a familiar framework to interpret events. Each analogy amplifies engagement because it invites reflection, debate, and even ridicule. Contradictions within reporting also fueled amplification. Different outlets presented conflicting interpretations of Meghan's alleged claims and William's responses. Was the sabotage intentional or misperceived? Was William protective, frustrated, or calculating? Contradiction keeps audiences hooked because unresolved tension invites debate, repeated consumption, and ongoing speculation. The media ecosystem thrives on this ambiguity, turning uncertainty into sustained attention. Emotional stakes drive engagement further. Reports of sabotage evoke sympathy for Meghan, moral judgment of the alleged perpetrators, and curiosity about family dynamics. Audiences feel invested emotionally, which makes them more likely to share, comment, and discuss. The narrative becomes self-perpetuating. Emotional engagement amplifies the story, which elicits more engagement. Timing, repetition, and emotional resonance combine to create a self-reinforcing cycle. Every article, every social media post, and every television segment built on the last. The narrative of sabotage and William's central role became omnipresent. It was not merely a story, it was a global phenomenon. Audience attention itself amplified the narrative. Each click, comment, and share was fuel for the fire. Interestingly, the media's amplification also magnified William's perceived involvement. Even minor gestures, offhand comments, or indirect actions were interpreted as strategic responses to alleged claims. His presence, or absence, became evidence in itself. In a story built on perception, media amplification transformed subtle signals into defining moments. William, silent or otherwise, became central because media and audience attention assigned him that role. Here's another layer: confirmation bias. Readers who already held opinions about Meghan or the royal family were more likely to interpret stories in ways that confirmed their beliefs. Amplification exploited this. Repeated exposure to the narrative reinforced pre-existing assumptions, making them harder to challenge. Each subsequent report cemented perceptions, whether accurate or not. But amplification is not neutral. It selectively highlights some elements while ignoring others. Positive interactions, reconciliatory moments, or clarifications might be downplayed or omitted, while conflict, tension, and drama dominate coverage. This selective amplification creates a skewed perception of reality, magnifying certain narratives at the expense of nuance or context. And here comes the cliffhanger. While media amplification had already made the sabotage narrative unavoidable, the next phase would involve direct confrontation. Moments where private concerns, public appearances, and William's positioning intersected in ways that would escalate the drama even further. The story was no longer just amplified. It was about to explode, taking unexpected twists that would captivate audiences worldwide. What if every glance, every gesture, every carefully measured word could spark global speculation? For Prince William, the story of Meghan Markle's alleged claims of sabotage became not just a narrative, but a minefield. His subtle signals, intentional or not, were scrutinized, analyzed, and amplified by millions. The public wasn't just observing him. They were interpreting him, constructing meaning from silence, body language, and carefully curated appearances. The first principle to understand is that perception often outweighs intention. William's every action was framed by the media and audience expectations. A neutral look at a public event could be interpreted as disapproval. A quiet handshake could be read as tension. Even a measured smile might be spun as forced diplomacy or strategic restraint. In the theater of public life, subtlety becomes magnified into significance. Consider one public appearance. William attended a charity event alongside senior royals, including Meghan, at a time when the narrative of alleged sabotage was dominating headlines. Observers analyzed his posture, the direction of his gaze, and the proximity to Meghan. Headlines speculated. William avoids eye contact. What does it mean? Silent tension or deliberate distance? Social media amplified these interpretations, producing thousands of discussions, debates, and meme threads. A moment that might have been mundane became a symbol of the ongoing drama. Timing again played a critical role. Public events coinciding with renewed media focus on Meghan's alleged claims acted as triggers for audience attention. William's presence, or absence, was instantly contextualized within the narrative of sabotage. Each appearance was not just about public duty. It became a narrative device, a signal to audiences about his stance, feelings, or loyalty. The line between ceremonial responsibility and storytelling blurred entirely. Direct audience engagement is another crucial element. Media outlets and commentators frequently posed questions to viewers. Is William siding with Meghan? Does this gesture suggest frustration? Could this subtle signal confirm the rumors? These questions invite audiences to participate in the story actively, turning passive observation into speculation and debate. Audiences begin constructing meaning, assigning motives, and creating theories, further amplifying the narrative. And then there's the emotional dimension. Subtle signals carry emotional weight precisely because they are ambiguous. A deliberate pause, a slight hesitation, or a change in tone can evoke empathy, suspicion, or intrigue. Humans are wired to detect social cues and interpret them emotionally. William's public behavior, combined with pre-existing narratives, became a canvas on which audiences projected their feelings, assumptions, and judgments. One surprising aspect is the interplay between private intention and public interpretation. William may have intended neutrality, professionalism, or decorum. Yet the public rarely interprets subtlety neutrally. Every gesture is loaded with potential meaning, magnified by media framing. A simple nod or smile becomes a narrative pivot. Every glance or body position sparks conversation about loyalty, conflict, or agreement. Humor and analogy also amplified these signals. Media commentators frequently compared William's gestures to high-stakes boardroom tactics, reality TV maneuvers, or even literary foreshadowing. These analogies made subtle actions comprehensible and emotionally resonant for audiences. By framing minor gestures as strategic moves, the media enhanced engagement and reinforced his centrality in the story. Contradictions emerge here as well. Different outlets interpreted the same gesture in opposite ways. Was William's distant posture protective or critical? Was his calm demeanor composed or calculating? The ambiguity ensured continued debate. Audiences remained captivated because the narrative was unresolved, encouraging repeated observation, discussion, and analysis. Social media further intensified the effects. Memes, threads, videos, and reaction posts dissected every moment. Algorithms rewarded content that provoked emotional response, meaning every interpretation spread rapidly. A subtle gesture viewed by thousands became amplified to millions, each layer of commentary adding nuance, speculation, or dramatic interpretation. The public collectively authored the ongoing narrative of William's signals. Psychologically, humans are drawn to hidden meaning. Subtlety invites curiosity and speculation. When signals are ambiguous, the mind fills gaps with narrative. William's body language, speech cadence, and public interactions became a puzzle for audiences to decode. This participation deepened engagement, making viewers invested in the story and emotionally attached to interpretations. And yet, there's a strategic dimension. William's subtle signals may have been designed to communicate without saying a word, adhering to royal protocol while influencing public perception. Silence, measured gestures, and controlled expressions can convey authority, disapproval, or neutrality, all without explicit statements. In a story built on interpretation, subtlety can be as powerful as direct commentary. Repetition reinforced these signals. Over multiple events, patterns emerged. Media and audiences began to read intent into repeated gestures. Was a glance consistent with earlier tension? Did a smile at a charity function signal reconciliation? Each repetition became part of the ongoing narrative, building a sense of continuity, credibility, and engagement. Emotional stakes remained high. Audiences empathized with William as a brother, son, and future king navigating complex relationships under intense scrutiny.